Hey there, Jeff.
Hey, how's it going, dude?
How are you?
Good. So this one we're gonna have better success than last time, right?
Yeah, you called in for Chris's call, right? Yeah, I'm learning too. I sent confirmations with the speakers earlier in the day, and there's the man himself, Jason.
Yeah.
Well, Jason, how are you?
Hey David, good. What about you?
Doing fine, thanks. Thanks for making time to join the call.
Yeah, absolutely. How's everything?
Uh, can't complain. Just interested in trying out a new format for our community, seeing if this leads to more value that I think we can share more readily as opposed to live meetups. How are
And
things
is
with
the
sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Is there a lag just so that I'm aware?
Maybe a slight lag. Could be
Maybe
a
a lag.
Hangout connectivity issue. I posted our links, so I think you can expect a few people to join, but I believe other people will be watching online and some may not participate directly. Looks like Jeff and Carlos are online
I'm
now,
not
Oh
and
yeah.
we've got
I'm not seeing any lag from you, David, but I did see a tiny lag from Jason.
okay.
All right, good to know. We'll just try not to talk over each other.
Jason, do you want to try to rejoin, perhaps? See if that solves the
Yeah,
problem.
yeah. Let me give it a shot.
I take it you're not seeing a lag from me.
I don't think so.
If I talk now, my words and my mouth are moving at the same time.
More or less. It's not a perfect technology, but I think this will work. Hi again, Jason.
Hey, I don't know if we're able to tell right now if there's a lag, but
It's
It's
better.
pretty good.
but okay, cool, great.
I want to make a quick announcement to the viewers, Jason, and then maybe we could dive in. We recognize that you've got about a half hour with us. So for those viewers who are, I see that there are 7 viewing, you're not able to directly participate in the call right now. If you want to be able to interact and ask questions of Jason, you do have the option of joining this call, as few others have done. That link is posted on the event site, on the Google Plus page, but I'll also post it here in the group chat. So you can look for a group chat button on top left of the Hangout. I think that should work. So do let me know if you're having trouble with that. Shoot me an email or something. But hope more of you can join as we go. And then with that, why don't I turn it over to Jason? Jason, you, just by way of quick introduction, we had connected through the community before. You were formerly a product manager at Yammer. You created a very successful how to get a job as a product manager content on Udemy. It's a course that was very successful, and now currently you are applying your former entrepreneurial and product management skills to building a new company and a product, right?
Yeah, yeah. That sums things up pretty well.
Well,
So,
I'll give you actually the floor to just say a little bit more about what you're doing, uh,
声音打开来可以吗？还是怎么样？
and then through the course of the talk, perhaps we can chime in and ask questions and see how this conversation goes.
yeah, that sounds good. Let's make it really interactive. And even informal, right? Like this should be a pretty casual talk.
For sure.
As far as what I'm doing now, after I left Yammer, which is about a year ago now, this month last year I left, and I was there for about 2 years. Basically, what I'm doing now is a company called Do, so you can check it out at do.com, do.com, and the idea is to basically fix bad meetings. after Yammer was bought by Microsoft, we had a ton of corporate meetings that I'm sure other folk can imagine what that's like. And so it just occurred to me that there wasn't a solution that I had seen, at least, and certainly not that I found even in the year since we started the company, that fixes that. Like, why do we have, and a lot of people at their companies, why do people just have a bunch of meetings? They don't necessarily get anything done in them. And when they do, it certainly can be more efficient, more delightful. So happy to dive into to do a bit as we go along. But like David said, I think that the focus would be largely around how product management as a discipline is applying in my role now, but equally important how it's not applying in the things that I wish that I learned more of when I was a PM that I could use as a founder now. So, David, I can continue from there, or I'm not sure if you wanted to chime in with anything else.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I'll just start off, and anybody feel free to chime in at whenever it makes sense. I'm not sure. We'll see how it works in the sort of Hangouts format. People could also put things in the chat as another way of throwing things out there. So when I was at Yammer, I focused on the entire suite of the product. That's the way that product managers were structured there. So people would work on growth. They would work on the new iPad app. They would work on the sign-up flow. People would work on platform integrations. The way we were structured, it wasn't really divided. And when I was there, I definitely, and I even I think I may have I think I've written a little bit about what I thought product management skills would do for people who wanted to later start their own companies. And I'd previously started an ed tech company, then was a PM at Yammer, and am now starting a company. So I've sort of experienced both things at different times in my life. That being said, I would say a few of the things that I think do apply well. Certainly knowing how to prioritize product and what to build is something that you should be getting good at as a PM. The flip side of that, though, is that when you're at a relatively successful company versus when you start your own company, it's actually quite different, right? Like our product roadmap and figuring out what goes on that roadmap now for Do is wildly different than at Yammer, where at Yammer it was the company already had product market fit by the time I joined, so that's a really different challenge when our company is 6 people, the product launched 12 weeks ago. So figuring that out is actually a bit of a different challenge. So we can go more into that, but in terms of prioritizing product, I think you learn that when you're a PM at another company, but when you're a founder of an early stage company, how to prioritize product, it's still useful to have that prior experience, but it's meaningfully different from what it's like at a bigger post-product market fit company. That's one thing I learned a bit about, and again, anybody can chime in here.
Jason, let's dig in a little bit deeper there in terms of prioritization, because that's a very important topic. Could you dive a little bit deeper and maybe give us how you approach prioritizing? And again, let's keep this to product. I understand as a CEO and a founder, you have many stakeholders and issues to deal with. But when it comes to product, how do you go about figuring out what matters most and then focusing your team efforts to achieve that outcome?
Yeah, so figuring out what matters the most and sort of organizing a team around it. I think figuring out what matters the most largely, I think from a product perspective, is determined. I found out that it's quite different depending on the stage of the company. So when I was at Yammer, figuring out what was important was largely driven by sort of the vision of the company and then working backwards and saying, and using, data comes up a lot, but we actually could use data there, whereas data is arguably a lot less useful, as many people know, when you're much smaller. But it was, okay, there's vision, and then what are our like yearly goals, quarterly goals, and then therefore, from a product perspective, we usually optimize for either engagement, retention, growth, or monetization. So in that case, it was just here are goals that in fact were set from say a leadership level at Yammer, where it was David Sachs, the CEO, or the rest of the leadership team, or other folks chiming in would have influence into that. And as a PM there, what to prioritize came from those sort of strategic goals, and then we would figure out what features might serve that. Whereas now, because as I mentioned, we're at a different stage, the sort of only goal in some ways is finding true product market fit. So we'll come up with experiments that might serve that, and you go and build things and test them against it. But it's different than having loftier sort of thematic goals that you have the luxury of setting to some extent when you've already achieved product market fit.
Okay, let's
ask something.
Jeff, you have a question. Sure.
Yeah. So, from what you were saying, Jason, it kind of reminds me of something I read a bit a while back that I thought was pretty interesting. Basically, they were saying there are 3 different kinds of product manager roles. One of them was the kind of fine-tuning the product that's already got the product market fit, as you were describing at Yammer. Another one was the product manager who's basically running a tech team, so a kind of a technical management function. And the last one was what they called a new product manager, which seems a little closer to the role that you have now. And does that seem like a reasonable kind of division of, do those 3 roles really exist as separate roles, or are they also always kind of combined, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting categorization. I would, and I think it fits pretty aptly in the 2 different scenarios I've thrown out there, particularly fine-tuning as compared to, say, being a new product PM. That being said, I think that there is, how do we classify when Facebook launches rooms, right? Or Instagram comes out with sort of hyperlapse, or Twitter launching, cards originally. These things are like products within companies, but it's hard to say sometimes because when Twitter did Twitter Music, right? It's like that they eventually, I believe, shuttered. It's like, well, they didn't necessarily have product market fit for such a meaningful product or sizable product like that, even though they were doing it inside of a much larger company. That being said, yeah, if you're going to change the size of the like button or do algo changes on the newsfeed at Facebook, those are definitely fine-tuning roles. So I think that the categorizations that you threw out definitely map onto what we all see in the field sometimes. But that being said, I would add the caveat that sometimes even large companies can have sort of new product PMs, which was probably implicit in what you were saying anyway. But I think it's worth noting, especially if people are considering what type of, like, ideally somebody would be good at both things as well, both, say, fine-tuning as well as being a new product PM, but sometimes they're really different skill sets. Off the cuff, I would imagine somebody who's really analytical from a quantitative standpoint would be great at fine-tuning. You could take, the algo feed from X level of engagement to Y better engagement really easily. Whereas a new product PM, I think I'm discovering more and more that qualitative skills matter more, and right, the ability to suss out, like, identifying product market fit and building towards that is a lot harder. Well, I shouldn't put a value judgment on it, but I think it's just a very different skill set than fine-tuning, and there are probably different personality types that align better with the 2 different roles.
Yeah, personally, I definitely see myself as more new product oriented. I'm actually looking for a product manager job now, so looking for that. Gotcha. And hoping that it's actually out there. That's one of the reasons I asked that question.
I think it's out there, but I think it's sometimes it's being done by, say, a founder at a early stage startup. So sometimes the job title or the role might not necessarily, or sometimes just like I would argue that there's perhaps aspects of a new product PM in, say, user researchers who are looking for signals from people even without a product that exists sometimes. So it's interesting where you're coming from, and something to keep in mind is that I guess sometimes these or like the analytics team at Yammer, who weren't PMs, they did a lot of what I would argue is the role of a fine-tuning PM in terms of finding patterns in the data set and whatnot. So something to keep in mind is whether the job title may be what it's not going to be called new product PM. So what does it look like?
Jason, would love to dig a little bit deeper into what you're doing with Do. And you talked about making meetings more, I suppose, more engaging, meaningful, effective. Can you share some examples of what you and the team are working on in terms of looking at that product?
Yeah. So most people would be quick to agree that, yeah, meetings suck. They're not productive, at least in many cases. So how do you solve it? So the way that we're thinking about it breaks down to a few different stories, right? So it wasn't necessarily rocket science what we found in early user research, where people say, okay, yeah, my meetings are unproductive, and if you dive into it, it's like, well, why? And people say things like, well, they don't have a purpose, or it wasn't clear what we were going to talk about, or everybody wasn't on the same page. And so that can be solved in many different ways. But what we've done is, among other things, we created this sort of common but flexible framework for meetings, where we said, okay, every meeting, if it has an agenda, if it starts on time and ends on time, if there are clear follow-ups and outcomes afterwards, chances are that'll fix a bulk of the problems that people are having with meetings. And so what we've done, and I don't know, David, do you think the screen share would work on?
Yeah, I think it would, and I thought you had some interesting things there, like timelines. So see if you could share a screenshot.
Give it a shot. So can you guys see this on my screen now?
Working.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So I was just jotting down notes for this. I use it for all sorts of things. I walk to work with a coworker, and we'll come into the office and put notes from our walk into Do even. So it's sometimes used for things other than meetings. But anyway, this is basically so you can set the agenda here. There's this timer for the time remaining. If Jason to send deck over. And then I can mark that as a follow-up, and then I can view all my follow-ups from all meetings in one place, and then I can click into a meeting, if I need to see the context that relates to. So anyway, without getting away from it, I'm just sharing this because this is sort of how we're tackling it, and of course, being a founder is one of those things that reminds you that it's very easy to criticize other people's products until you start looking at your own user voice inbox, basically, and start realizing, oh, wow, that's not intuitive, or that's buggy, or any number of other things. But anyway, back to your original point, David, was just that we identified a series of problems that people have with meetings, and to date have simply just tried to tackle it head on and build, okay, you can add an agenda, you can have a timer, you can keep track of your follow-ups. Just so actually everybody has a reference, I'll just quickly share a couple other things. David mentioned the timeline. So what we have here is basically your Google Calendar in a timeline format. You can view it in a larger manner as well. So that's what this is. And we're building an Outlook integration soon. We can talk about the value of Outlook versus Google and how to paste that and all that stuff. And this is search. So a vision we have for the company is you should be able to type in Uber and see any meeting that you have, or call it Sherpa, which is the venture firm where I've collaborated with folks here. Anyway, so these are a few different things that we offer, and anyway, we can go back into the fast track here. But anyway, and you can attach files to a meeting. You can share the meeting notes out so that you don't have to, as a PM, write up the minutes afterwards and send them out. You can take private notes here. So if this was during the PM Fast Track, if anybody was using Do, they'd be able to see my notes that I'm adding here. They could contribute, but they could also say, maybe you don't want me to know this, but say, I'm skeptical of Jason's take on the world. And that would be obviously just for you, unless, of course, you're screen sharing like I am. And anyway, so that's a bit more about the product. And if anybody has questions about that and like product decisions we made and how what I learned at Yammer or may not apply or anything like that. I'm happy to dive into that too.
Yeah, I actually want to ask one question on behalf of a reader who wrote in, and then afterwards I'm going to shut up because I really want to encourage everybody else to see if they have questions for you. So Maria asked if if you find other PMs bringing their product ideas, or if it's normally coming from the executive team. I'm not sure the context in which that was asked. Maybe I think you responded at Yammer. A lot of the roadmap was set, but maybe you could kind of compare contrast briefly how that might look at your team versus what you'd experienced.
Yeah, so I mean, if we sort of just make our own sort of hybrid question out of that, it's like it sounds like to what extent is the roadmap set or affected by, say, PMs versus an executive team or a leadership team?
Sure.
And on that level, I'd actually like. I mean, as much as I say like the roadmap was often set by like the higher ups at Yammer, a lot of the like PMs often would still affect the roadmap or contribute to it because often you were closer to the user and maybe actually did user research calls, whereas usually a leadership team at a fast-growing startup is out fundraising or evangelizing the product or any number of other things. So just wanted to clarify that. And so I feel like as far as an ideal situation, and every company is different, but the roadmap should be a collaboration between the leadership team, PMs, honestly other functions as well. Like support has a lot of good input. Your sales team, there's a lot of sort of consternation sometimes from the PM community on sales and what customers ask for versus what you should actually build. And there's something to that, but yet shouldn't ignore what your sales and marketing teams are telling you. It should be another input, which, just as a quick tangent, relates to when people talk about listen to your users or your customers. Like there's a nuance there, right? Like listen to doesn't. It can mean many different things. It can mean do what somebody says, which in this context probably isn't true. Sometimes it means listen, just literally ask them and listen. Sometimes it also means they'll read between the lines. And so if half your sales group is asking for more administrative features, and say you haven't released a paid product yet, and they're just asking for more administrative features, maybe the thing one should do is step back and say, wait a minute, shouldn't we, what's the paid product look like? Because if we're talking about all these admin features, we should probably, anyway, conceivably you would have a paid product at that point if you have admin features, but anyway, and especially if you have salespeople, I would hope that you have a paid product at that point. But anyway, so yeah, so to Maria's original question, I feel like it's a collaboration not only between, say, a leadership team and individual PMs, but really across all departments, if you will, within a company. Of course, it's not a consensus-driven thing. It shouldn't just be everybody gets a vote and then you just build what everybody votes on. It should be a little more deliberate than that, probably. And even outside of the company, of course, you should factor in user feedback and stuff like that. So those are a couple thoughts on what Maria raised. And so I know David wanted to shut up. Does anybody else have thoughts that they wanted to contribute?
I have another question if nobody else is ready to jump in. So this past week I attended a meetup where Jay Haynes from Strategine presented their model of jobs to do as a way of identifying things that customers are trying to accomplish with a particular product. And I guess it's been around for a while, and I hadn't run across it before. And it looked really good to me. Is that something you've run across? Have you ever tried using that model?
I think I've heard of it, perhaps with different language, but I wouldn't be very well educated on the subject, so I probably would sound a little foolish if I tried to. But if I understand correctly and remember correctly, I think it has to do with, like, people talk about personas sometimes or cohorts in a different lens and jobs to do.
Yeah, it's sort of more like going to your customers, not to ask them how to solve a problem, but basically to find out the things that they're trying to accomplish.
Right. So I think this is a different, like, sort of framework that otherwise people try to accomplish with personas and other sort of things. And
Yeah.
for what it's worth, I do like it. Like I think that it gets to the heart of the issue sometimes. And I remember a story I heard about one of the sort of digital. Oh yeah, I think this was EchoSign, and I think Jason Lemkin from who started EchoSign, I think has a story about where he there was some clerk who, EchoSign is basically just digital signatures. That's one way of describing it, and there was a clerk who would use this product, and he didn't understand why exactly, but the more he digged into it, he realized that yes, they used it for the signatures and began to use it, but perhaps more importantly, it was actually just a document repository. This clerk was responsible for receiving and organizing all these digital documents, and using EchoSign was just a hook, basically, into this broader sort of document repository. And the more he sort of talked to her and other people like her, it was like, oh, this is the job that you do, and the type of person who's exchanging files and organizing them, whether they're like a investment manager for somebody and they just get investment docs back and forth, whether you're a documentation clerk at like a shipping company, you might have a similar role, and there's jobs to do, as you're saying. And anyway, once they understood that better, they were able to think of their identity as a product a lot more clearer, or a lot more clearly.
Anyone else for Jason? You could ask him anything. He's a founder and a product manager. Well, Jason, anything else on your mind then, in
I'll
terms
ask
of?
another question if nobody else wants to talk.
Sure.
So a long time ago, when I first came out to California, I ran into a group of people who had a company called Interaction Associates, and they published a book called Making Meetings Work. Was the name of it, I think, or How to Make Meetings Work. I don't know if you've ever run across that book, but they were basically the ones who started the whole meeting facilitation movement.
Mm-hmm.
It was back into that was like early '80s that they were really pushing that. And I'm just wondering if you reference stuff like that, or where did you kind of get your concepts, for starting your company?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, it's a thing we've thought about in terms of how much of the product should be influenced by existing methodologies and literature, basically, that's been written about the space. And we've consumed as much of it as we can to try to understand what people have figured out before and not repeat mistakes, and then build software that embodies it to some extent. But it has been a strategic decision that maybe some people can relate to, where if that does exist, you build a product sort of on top of that, right? Like I think there are some productivity solutions built on top of the getting things done movement and methodology. Or do you use that as an input but try to define your own way of doing things, if you will, whether it's an explicit methodology or whether it's just an interface that has an opinion. And so for what it's worth, we've learned from those things, but decided to date to build software that takes what we think to be the best of N worlds and offers it to people. That being said, over time, you can imagine from a product perspective, something on our roadmap would be, partnerships with companies and experts that do have these existing methodologies where we can sort of serve as a technology engine for them. And you could just push a button and run a meeting, the Bob way or the Interaction Associates way or any number of other ways. We're just a platform for all of that as opposed to explicitly tying ourselves to a single methodology. So those are just some thoughts about taken how we've approached. If you're building a product in a space where there's an existing methodology, do you just embody a methodology? Do you sort of subsume a bunch of them? Do you maybe at some point make it a feature in your product to be able to tap into those? We're probably more doing the second and the third things, but it's certainly something on our collective mind as a company. But like I said, the way we're approaching it is to develop our own sort of purely user-informed way of, well, not purely, I shouldn't say purely user-informed, but by comparison against other methodologies, it's user-informed way of running meetings, and then over time, just incorporating more and more of these ways of doing things to try to build a more robust product.
Jason, maybe by way of closing question, I wanted to ask a question that I was curious about, and hopefully others can actually benefit from a practical skill. So a lot of moving forward with the product just has to do with having good process and being able to make steps forward. How do you? I understand that for your product, you guys are still exploring product market fit, and in that context, how do you baseline? Even if you don't have great measurements, do you have a sense of where you're starting from and what an improvement looks like? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, because even though it's early and it's a small product, we still do have, at this point, a large enough user base that if we wanted to A/B test something, we can do that. If we want to simply compare month over month and see whether we're making progress, we can do that, or day over day, or week over week. So for us, the methods aren't radically different from what we might be doing at a somewhat larger company with respect to you have your sort of period numbers, whether it's weekly, monthly, or something else, and then you can benchmark against that. And then as far as testing, that's all the same. As far as like moving forward and towards a goal, it is a little, until you're truly post-product market fit. I think it's a big risk to think that you are when you're not, and that leads to all sorts of problems. Aside from delusion, it's also like you might start focusing on growth when you shouldn't. So you can still, even as you're like marching towards it, there's still, our DAUs going up. Is the average for us, like, is the average number of agenda items and notes created by user going up over time? And when we released this feature, whether we A/B tested it or if it was a smaller thing that we didn't test, did we at least see our numbers hold or go up over time such that we feel confident enough that we didn't break something? So I think even when you're small, it's possible to benchmark. I wouldn't over-invest in things like A/B testing when you're too small, but you should be benchmarking. You should be moving towards something, because otherwise, if you're waiting until you feel like you've hit product market fit, it's just going to be this moving target that you don't really have a sense for. So to the extent that we can, we're doing our best to create some sort of milestones and some sort of vision of what it looks like, and then at least measure ourselves against that.
Thank you so much, Jason.
I have another one if you guys are game for another question.
Sure, we can do one more and then we can wrap up after that.
Okay. So I just finished reading 0 to 1. And one thing that was in there that I really kind of resonated for me was the idea that when you're doing a startup, I've made a few startup attempts myself, go after a small market that you can basically dominate. Almost to the point of monopoly is really what he's pushing. So did you guys take that approach, and how did you identify that market, and what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a really good point that actually we're actively discussing as a team right now. In that the short answer is no, and not for no. We haven't defined a really narrow market that we feel like we can completely own and expand from there. And I do think there's merit to that approach. We've defined our market in many ways, whether it's the biggest version of it is anybody with meetings, which is really anybody on Earth, which is probably the furthest thing you could get from defining a clear small market to completely own. That being said, we've also said, well, we're going to own like meetings for project and product managers at companies between 50 and 1,000 people, and that's something where we know that there's not meeting software that those people at those companies are using. We can own that. But even then, that might not be as niche or small as somebody else might choose to define an initial market to go after. You might say only at San Francisco, like we're only going to focus on startup PMs and helping them run meetings better through Do, and it's all going to be on do.com all the time. So we've thought about it. I think that before I'll say this, and we might still choose to sort of pursue that way of doing things a bit more structure in a more structured manner. But I think one thing that we're benefiting from is by touching a lot of different groups from the outset, we're figuring out if we are going to pick a narrow market, which one should it be. If we had started instead by saying, well, we're only going to focus on like systems analysts at economic consulting research firms, how do we know that that's the right group to build this for? We don't really. And so there's some value, I think, in like first exposing yourself to everybody, not to always be building everything for everybody, but to learn from who you should be building for. And then it sounds a little backwards to some extent to narrow after the fact, but you could potentially narrow once you've learned enough, and then sort of use that as your bowling pin strategy and start with that one group and then go on to many others. So I think there's a lot of merit to that way of thinking about things, but I think it's missing some pieces from a product development standpoint, because there's a lot to gain from learning about more than just that one initial audience.
Cool. Thanks for your time, Jason. I know sometimes I run into you walking around streets of San Francisco, so maybe we'll run into each other again in person soon.
Look forward to it.
Really appreciate your time. And for everybody who's watching and who called in, I think if you want to pick Jason's brain and experience further, I think a great way to do that would be to check out his product, do.com, and see if you have suggestions or questions about what they're doing with that. I think is always a good way to engage with the product team and learn in the process. Actually two more quick announcements. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Andy Galpern from Cascade SF is going to lead a persuasive design for our community for product managers. So if you have time to call in at 2 p.m. tomorrow, keep an eye out for that. And I noticed that there are a few people on the call who are watching who are aspiring PMs. Carlos, who's on the call right now, he runs a program called Product School. So you may want to check that out and connect with Carlos if you're interested in learning more. And by way of disclosure, I'm not paid by Jason or Carlos to say these things. I just wanted to share those resources with all of you. Great, thanks everybody. Thanks for your time.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks.